Good evening. There is news just breaking now at the end of an already historic day. The White House appears to have just now blinked in the standoff that today left President Trump facing the specter of impeachment. He's certainly not there yet, not by any means, but only two presidents have ever been impeached, Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton. And Richard Nixon resigned before the House could act. So President Trump is in very rare company. Today's action by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, along with the president's own statements and actions over the past days and weeks, have now put the White House and Congress on a path rarely traveled in the 243 years of this country's existence. Whether you agree with what Speaker Pelosi announced today or not, today is significant. It was just after 5 Eastern time that Speaker Pelosi, out in front of a rising wave of pro-impeachment sentiment in her caucus, made the day historic.
The actions of the Trump presidency revealed the dishonorable fact of the president's betrayal of his oath of office, betrayal of our national security, and betrayal of the integrity of our elections. Therefore, today, I'm announcing the House of Representatives moving forward with an official impeachment inquiry. I'm directing our 6 committees to proceed with their investigations under that umbrella of impeachment inquiry. The president must be held accountable. No one is above the law.
Well, at immediate issue is the intelligence that whistleblower complaint, which the White House has so far been keeping from Congress, and the president's phone conversation with the president of Ukraine, allegedly to get Ukrainian help in damaging his leading opponent, Joe Biden. Now, the White House is now promising to release a transcript of the phone call tomorrow morning, which is not enough for House Democrats, who will soon get a chance to question the acting director of national intelligence, who stopped the complaint from being forwarded to Congress, and the whistleblower. Nor is it enough for the Senate, which took rare bipartisan action late today on the whistleblower's complaint. And as we mentioned at the very top, that is not even the half of it. Let's begin with Jim Acosta with the breaking news. So what are you learning about the possible release of the whistleblower complaint itself?
Yeah, Anderson, we understand White House officials are looking at this right now. It could come out as soon as tomorrow. My colleagues are reporting that the president weighed in on this and decided ultimately on his own that he wanted to see this whistleblower complaint released. We're not sure what form it will come in, whether we will see all of it. But it is a curious change of events. The White House essentially blinked in all of this. If we do see all of it, we're not sure if we're going to see all of it, but recall last week when the Inspector General for the intelligence community went up on Capitol Hill, talked to the House Intelligence Committee, and was essentially telling those lawmakers, we can't show you what's in this complaint. And so this is a major reversal for the White House, no question about it, Anderson.
What about the release of the transcript of the president's call with the Ukrainian president? And were there multiple calls? Do we know? Because the reporting for the Wall Street Journal initially was that there were at least 8 mentions of, or 8 efforts mentioning, focusing on Biden. Do we know if that was all in one call?
Right. I think that's one of the key questions in the whistleblower complaint. Remember, the whistleblower complaint dealt with multiple interactions, and so that may get us to that answer. And whether or not we see all of the whistleblower complaint, that remains to be seen. But Anderson, the president did authorize the release of that call transcript. He tweeted as much earlier this afternoon. He says Secretary of State Mike Pompeo got permission from the Ukrainian side to go ahead and release this information. But very important for our viewers to understand at this point, Anderson, the White House is starting to downplay expectations as to what is going to be in that call transcript. I talked to 2 White House officials this evening who said prepare to be underwhelmed, prepare to see the contents of that transcript and find those contents to be underwhelming at this point. That puts a lot of pressure on what is in that whistleblower complaint. And Anderson, as you know, as we've all been following this, the White House has gone to great lengths, including the president, to call into question the credibility of this whistleblower. And in the words of one White House official I spoke with this evening, they're referring to this whistleblower as the so-called whistleblower. So they're not putting a lot of stock in what that employee has to say at this point. But Anderson, put all of that to the side. Keep in mind what happened when the president walked into the United Nations earlier this morning before he gave that speech to the United Nations General Assembly. He admitted to reporters that he held up aid to Ukraine. This after he admitted to reporters that he pressured the Ukrainian president in a phone call to try to get dirt on former Vice President Joe Biden. That is what Democrats are focusing on at this point. And the president all day long was saying there was no quid pro quo. Democrats are saying you don't need a quid pro quo because the president was pressuring the Ukrainian president to try to get dirt on former Vice President Joe Biden.
It's interesting, Jim, because President Trump and others in the White House have been saying, well, this was about overall concern about corruption in Ukraine. And what's odd about that is there are plenty of countries in the world that the U.S. has dealings with and sells military aid to and gives military aid to, which have widespread corruption. We haven't heard the president really talk about corruption in Saudi Arabia or anywhere else. And also, if he's very concerned about corruption in Ukraine, if the only example he is talking about, and again, it's totally an alleged example, there's no evidence, if he's focusing only on the Bidens or Joe Biden's son, it's hard to imagine that that's the prime example of alleged corruption in Ukraine.
That's right, Anderson. And it's interesting. Over the last 48 hours, we've seen the president shift in his rationale as to why, he isn't in any hot water in all of this. He was saying earlier that they were holding up the money to Ukraine because of his concerns about corruption. As you said, the United States has dealt with many countries around the globe that have corruption issues. Keep in mind, Saudi Arabia executed a journalist, it appears, in Jamal Khashoggi last year. We're coming up on the one-year anniversary of that. That appears to be not a problem for the White House when it comes to dealings with Saudi Arabia, and yet there's a concern about corruption when it comes to Ukraine. The other thing that the president was talking about was, well, the Europeans aren't donating enough money. They're not contributing enough money to help the Ukrainians in dealing with Russian aggression. That also is not the case. Europeans have been at the table contributing money to helping Ukraine deal with Russian aggression. So the president has been shifting in his rationale. He's been dancing around all this issue all this week. The question is whether or not this is one of those episodes, Anderson. We've seen this movie before, whether the events and the facts and what the president has said will eventually catch up with them.
Yeah,
Anderson.
Jim Acosta, thanks very much. We have just heard from the whistleblower's attorney a brief statement which reads, quote, "We applaud the decision to release the whistleblower complaint as it establishes that ultimately the lawful whistleblower disclosure process can work. We await the release of the complaint in its totality." With that, let's go to CNN's Mano Raju at the Capitol. Mano, do we know how the release of this complaint is going to affect the decision to move forward by Democrats?
We don't know yet because what the Democrats announced today was an impeachment inquiry. What they didn't announce was actually voting to impeach the president. That would be presumably the next step. So if the complaint doesn't show any wrongdoing, or if the president, the transcript that he eventually releases doesn't show the president doing anything wrong in the eyes of Democrats, or if there's no evidence the president sought to hold up military aid to Ukraine in exchange for investigating the Bidens, perhaps they'll have a different tactic. But if there are significant concerns, red flags, a smoking gun in there, that could, of course, expedite the push to impeach this president, because the Democrats have been demanding this information. But Anderson, one of the reasons why they were considering impeaching the president is because of his refusal to turn over this information. They say it would be obstruction of Congress. So at least if that is provided, perhaps that will be one less count they would add to their impeachment inquiry, articles of impeachment, Anderson.
Yeah, what Speaker Pelosi was saying today was that, this is now under the umbrella of an impeachment inquiry, and that the 6 investigations that are already underway will proceed under that umbrella. Does that actually really change anything? I mean, is this just, there was a lot of debate among Democrats, well, it doesn't matter what you call it, it's an inquiry, it's an investigation, whatever. Is anything really new here other than Speaker Pelosi is now calling it an investigation, an inquiry?
In a sense, no. It's essentially a continuation of what the House Democrats have been doing. There are 6 committees that are investigating this president. They're including the House Judiciary Committee, the House Intelligence Committee, looking at all aspects of the president, his businesses, and his past. And what they have said, at least in the last several weeks, particularly the House Judiciary Committee, is that this investigation will ultimately decide whether or not to impeach the president. Democrats have been saying it's an impeachment inquiry because at the end of the day, they're going to make that decision. So what Pelosi said was that these investigations investigations will simply just continue. And ultimately, we will decide whether to impeach this president, which is the same thing essentially as what they have been doing. So there really is not going to be a whole lot of change. But the significant thing of her announcing her support of actually calling it an impeachment inquiry, a lot of Democrats interpret that to mean that she is ready to move forward when the time comes to eventually impeach the president. And of course, that would be a historic move for only the third president in American history to get impeached, even if it would be ultimately unsuccessful in the Republican-led Senate, where two-thirds majority would be needed to remove the president from office. But Democrats are pushing to go forward, and the Speaker's blessing today makes it more likely that we could see articles of impeachment in the coming months, Anderson.
So what is the process in that inquiry from here on out?
Well, expect these committees to continue their investigation. Then afterwards, if they do believe it's time to impeach the president, then the actual articles of impeachment will be drafted. Then the House Judiciary Committee will actually vote on those articles of impeachment. The full House then would vote soon thereafter. And then it would go to the Senate, where they would have the trial, and then presumably would acquit the president, at least on the votes they have right now. The president would not be convicted. But it's unclear exactly how long this will take. Speaker Pelosi, behind closed doors, Anderson, I'm told Democrats she wants to be done, quote, expeditiously. And Jerry Nadler has said that he wants this done by the end of the year. So the question is, can they do that? And if it runs into the election year, how much does that impact things?
Yeah.
Anderson?